Okay, so today we're going to talk about philosophy and what it is, and then we'll get into some talk about knowledge and Plato and some of the early philosophers. So here we have a short little overview of what philosophy is. We're about concerned with examining the universe and our place in it. So we're trying to figure out stuff in the world. And we'll get into what that involves in a little bit, but we're kind of interested in the space that's left by science and religion and common sense, and there are certain things that we want to know that perhaps those can't really answer for us, and that's changed over the years. What is some of the things that used to be considered philosophy are now considered science because of our technological advancements and scientific advancements, but it's never going to be the case that everything is explainable by science. So we still have this space for reason and finding out things that maybe we can't explain through other means. And some of the areas of philosophy are listed here. So we talk about things like knowledge, which is what epistemology is, and we're going to kind of begin with that. We explore different aspects of religion. We're going to do some of that in this class, and we'll kind of see how that's different from just theology later on. Aesthetics, which is the study of art, philosophy of science. Kind of obvious. Metaphysics is the study of what there is and what the nature of the universe is. We're going to talk about the other ones are fairly straightforward. Existentialism is kind of just a different way of looking at some of the same questions, and we'll talk about that some later on as well. And that's the chapter that's called The Human Condition. So we kind of are beginning with Plato, even though we know that Plato was not the beginning. There were a lot of philosophers before Plato, but a lot of Western philosophy begins with Plato, partly just because it's kind of Western and fits into our sort of Western picture. That's not really fair, but that's kind of the way a lot of philosophy classes begin. He's also very accessible and readable, so we're going to see a couple of excerpts from him as we go along. But one of the things they said was that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that's kind of the reason behind why he wanted to do philosophy and why he began to write, was the idea that it's useful to learn about the world, that it's not just kind of pointless to try to figure out these questions. So that this is actually part of a good life for Plato and Aristotle and a lot of other philosophers as well. So we are going to begin with some things from Plato here. One is this idea of learning. So Plato does a lot in the dialogue, the Meno, but one of the things he does is talk about what knowledge is. And he has this idea that he didn't really start himself, but existed before his time. The idea that, okay, how do we learn something? Because if we are learning about something, we can't know nothing about it, because if we know nothing about it, then we wouldn't even know where to start. And if we already know about it, then we don't need to learn about it. So this is kind of what Socrates calls a dilemma, or he ends up calling sort of a false dichotomy. So it's a problem that he says is not really a problem, because there is a solution, and that is that learning is actually remembering, according to Plato, which seems really strange. But the idea is that somehow we knew things before we were born. We came into this world not knowing nothing, but actually being in sort of a state between knowing and not knowing. So this idea that somehow we found out stuff, or we were born with certain kinds of knowledge, or at least knowledge that we once had, so perhaps we forgot it. This is what he brings up in the Meno, and you can see this some of this in the excerpt in the textbook. But the idea here is that before we were born, we somehow interacted with the realm of the forms. It's not exactly clear how that's supposed to work. There's a lot of discussion about that, but leaving that aside for the moment, The idea is that the forms are sort of the perfection of concepts. These can be abstract concepts like the good, justice, but also weirdly things like animals, like dogs, like humans, like anything physical as well. So, your dog at home might be a lesser example of the form of the dog. Your good act might be a lesser form of the good. And the form of the good happens to be the most important form for Plato. So we can sort of put it at the top of the realm of the forms. And we can't have knowledge or be a good person or any of these things, but even have knowledge, and importantly, without knowing the form of the good. And this is something that everyone naturally desires to know, according to Plato. And if we do stuff wrong, if we desire something that's not good, then he thinks it's actually just because we are ignorant. And so we all naturally want the good, so if we are striving towards something that's bad for us, it's just because we're wrong, we're ignorant, not because we actually want to do evil. And one of the most famous ways that he illustrates this is something we call the cave allegory. So it's the idea that we imagine people chained to a wall in a cave, and you have to kind of picture this, and I have a thing where you can draw it, but there's also a video where you can watch that this is linked to, which kind of illustrates it if you have trouble sort of picturing it in your mind. And you can also read the excerpt in the textbook. But the basic idea is that people are chained to the wall. They can't see behind them, so they can only see in front of them. And what's in front of them is shadows that are cast by people. If you think about those shadow puppets that you did on the wall when you were a kid with maybe a flashlight, instead there's a fire, and then they make shadows on the wall. And these people who are chained to the wall, they think the shadows are what's their reality. That's the only reality they know. They can't turn their head, they can't even look at each other. So that this is their reality. And the idea is that this is supposed to be the way we are in the world. We are normally sort of forced into a particular kind of perception, which is our perception of the regular world. But he says that this is not knowledge, that what we think we're seeing is just ephemeral stuff, just things that don't, it's not so much that they don't exist, but that they don't really matter. Like the shadows exist, right? But they're not important in the sense that they're not real in the same way that the stuff is casting the shadows is real. So we're missing something really important according to Plato, and that is the forms. So this is what this is supposed to mean. And so one of the prisoners escapes, goes out and sees the actual world, and the world that prisoner sees then represents the realm of the forms that we saw before we were born, that maybe we can get back to through philosophy. And the sun that this prisoner sees the world by, that represents the form of the good that you would see if you were to somehow go to the realm of the forms. It's like metaphorical, right? So that's sort of, and it's important too that I think this is something a lot of people miss that I didn't really bring up in the notes in the textbook, is that these people are chained to the wall by other people. The fact that he has them chained is not a coincidence, I think. He has them chained because somebody is sort of forcing us to perceive the world this way. That I think he also thinks that society and other people don't want us to know the truth necessarily. This sounds like a conspiracy theory, but really, if you want to control people, you don't want them to have all the knowledge. And so I think there's something that he's saying about that as well, and that we need to be aware of not only our epistemological constraints that come from just being human, but also the ones that come from society and that come from other people and power structures as well. So we can't really have knowledge of things in the world, and we're going to get more into what this means when we talk about knowledge later. We can, the prisoners who are chained to the wall get to where they can anticipate which shadow is going to come next, but that, according to Plato, is not really knowledge, right? Because it's not important in the same way that knowledge is. So for Plato, you have to not only get to knowledge in a certain way, but you have to have knowledge of the right things. The only thing we can really know is the forms, because they're eternal and they don't change. Things that change, we can't really have knowledge of. We might have true opinions, so in the sense that we might know, or true belief, we might know that the next thing is going to be the cat. But that doesn't, the next shadow, say, the shadows that move across the wall that the prisoners are looking at, but that doesn't really count as knowledge for Plato. And so interestingly too, this idea of knowledge as memory comes out in other ways later on. So Noam Chomsky, and that more recently, argued that we have concept of things, and in fact even innate ideas about language before we were born, and this is supposed to explain how children easily learn something as complicated as a language. So this idea of learning as memory, or learning, having things innately, is not necessarily just confined to Plato. So this is just a short little introduction to knowledge and some of the things we've said about knowledge, and we're going to get into more in the next presentation.